Please be seated. Our readings from Maundy Thursday recount defining moments in the history of Israel and the life of Jesus. But more than simply recounting these events, we are called to relive the experiences anew and connect the past to our lives today. The Last Supper took place during the Passover festival, which commemorates the escape of the ancient Hebrews from slavery in Egypt. The Passover meal was to be the first act of their new existence as people of God. And Moses and Aaron relayed specific instructions for the meal. Each household was to slaughter a year-old lamb without blemish at twilight. The flesh was to be roasted and eaten with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. Anything that was not consumed that night was to be burned. They were to eat in haste, ready to travel, sandals on their feet, and staff in hand. Blood from the slaughtered lamb was to mark the doorposts of every house where it was eaten. The blood was a sign of God's protection, so that Israel would be exempted from the final plague that would take all the firstborn of Egypt. God promised the enslaved, "When I see the blood, I will pass over you." Once freed from bondage, the released were to observe the Passover meal each year as a perpetual ordinance. After their freedom was established and they inhabited their own land, the meal could be eaten in leisure with a lot more ceremony. But it would still be eaten in remembrance of their hurried flight from oppression. As Christians, we recall the Passover meal as we connect it to our celebration of the Eucharist, as described by St. Paul the Apostle in his first letter to the Corinthians. St. Paul tells us that on the night Jesus was betrayed, he took bread, gave thanks, and broke it to share with others. These are ordinary actions carried out by the head of the household at any formal meal. But here Jesus identifies the shared bread with himself and with his body about to be broken on the cross. And Jesus took the cup of wine to be shared and identified with his blood that was soon to be shed. This cup is the new covenant in my blood, he tells us. In the book of Exodus, Moses, after building an altar, sent young men of the people of Israel who offered burnt offerings and sacrificed oxen as offerings of well-being to the Lord. Then he took the book of the covenant and read it in the hearing of the people, and they said, "All that the Lord has spoken we will do, and we will be obedient." Moses took the blood and dashed it on the people and said, "See the blood of the covenant that the Lord has made with you." Just as Moses sealed God's covenant with Israel with blood, the blood of Christ signifies for us the new covenant. As St. Paul explains, both the bread and the cup are to be consumed as a memorial to Jesus' redeeming life and work. For our Paschal Lamb, Christ has been sacrificed, and our deliverance is great. The ancient Hebrews were delivered from slavery in Egypt. You and I have been set free from the power of evil and death. In John's Gospel, there is no account of the blessing of bread and wine as the body and blood of Christ. In John's Gospel, there is no commandment to bless bread and wine in remembrance of Christ. Instead, Jesus washes his disciples' feet as an extraordinary example of servanthood. As Jesus contemplated his imminent separation from his followers, he realized how much he loved them. So as the disciples were gathered together before the Passover, Jesus took a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet. This was a task ordinarily performed by a slave, an act of humility comparable to identifying a redeeming life with the common elements of bread and wine, and a gesture of hospitality that embodies the teaching of the gospel. And among those whose feet Jesus washed was Judas Iscariot, whose intent to betray him Jesus already knew. For he knew who was to betray him. For this reason he said, "Not all of you are clean." Jesus set an example of humility and self-sacrifice, of leadership as service. His disciples are instructed to follow his example and be servants of one another. Before Jesus makes the ultimate sacrifice for us, he says, "I give you a new commandment, that you love one another. Just as I have loved you, you should love one another. By this everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another."